Chapter 1. Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. Barbara Hutton entered the world on November 14, 1912, as heir to the Woolworth five and dime empire, inheriting a fortune that would eventually exceed $50 million. Her childhood unfolded in palatial mansions, surrounded by every luxury imaginable, yet beneath the gilded surface lay profound tragedy. When Barbara was just 5 years old, her mother Edna died under mysterious circumstances, leaving the child emotionally orphaned despite her material abundance. Raised by distant relatives and hired help, Barbara learned early that wealth could purchase everything except genuine love and security. Her coming of age coincided with the Great Depression, creating a stark contrast between her privilege and the nation's suffering. Her debutante ball in 1930 cost $60,000, a fortune when families were starving, earning her the nickname Poor Little Rich Girl and public resentment that would follow her throughout life. This chapter establishes the central paradox of Barbara's existence, how someone who possessed everything could feel as though she had nothing, setting the stage for a lifetime spent trying to buy what money could never provide. November 14, 1912, Wednesday, New York City. The Woolworth mansion on Fifth Avenue glittered like a jewel box that autumn evening, its windows blazing with light as servants rushed through marble hallways, preparing for the arrival of a new heir. When Barbara Hutton drew her first breath, she became instant royalty in America's aristocracy of wealth. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, had built an empire from humble five and dime stores, transforming pennies and nickels into millions that seemed to multiply like magic. Barbara's nursery occupied an entire wing of the mansion, decorated with hand-painted murals depicting fairy tales, where princesses always lived happily ever after. Everything surrounding this infant spoke of permanence, security, and unlimited resources. Her cradle, crafted from rare mahogany and inlaid with mother-of-pearl, had once belonged to Russian royalty. Silk curtains framed windows overlooking Central Park, and the scent of imported roses filled rooms designed to shelter her from every hardship the world might offer. Yet within this palace of privilege, darkness already stirred. Barbara's mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, moved through the mansion's rooms like a ghost, her beauty marred by an inexplicable sadness that no luxury could dispel. Servants whispered about her strange moods, her long hours spent staring from windows, her sudden tears without apparent cause. Frank Hutton, Barbara's father, remained largely absent, pursuing business interests that kept him far from his troubled wife and infant daughter. The child grew in this atmosphere of wealth and melancholy, attended by a rotating staff of nannies who provided physical care but little genuine affection. By age 3, Barbara had learned to navigate the mansion's vast spaces alone, a tiny figure in expensive dresses wandering through rooms filled with priceless art and empty of warmth. She developed an early habit of talking to herself, creating imaginary companions to fill the void left by parents who existed more as distant figures than sources of comfort. May 2nd, 1917, Wednesday, New York City. Barbara was 4 years old when the silence came. Her mother had retreated to her bedroom, and the house held its breath in that peculiar way that precedes tragedy. The official story would speak of an accidental overdose, but whispers circulated through society's inner circles about deliberate choice, about a woman finally overwhelmed by demons that wealth could neither exorcise nor appease. When little Barbara asked repeatedly when her mother would return, no one could provide an answer that made sense to a child's heart. The loss transformed Barbara's inheritance from blessing to burden. She became not just an heiress, but a symbol, a living reminder of tragedy wrapped in privilege. Her grandfather, devastated by his daughter's death, retreated further into his business empire, leaving Barbara's upbringing to hired help and distant relatives. The child learned to associate wealth with absence, luxury with loneliness, privilege with pain. As Barbara entered adolescence, her fortune grew through careful investments and trust fund arrangements. By her teenage years, she commanded resources that exceeded the treasuries of small nations. Yet she remained emotionally impoverished, desperate for connections that money couldn't manufacture. She attended the finest schools, where classmates befriended her for her wealth rather than her character. She traveled to Europe, staying in grand hotels and visiting cultural landmarks, always surrounded by chaperones and staff, but never by peers, who saw her simply as Barbara rather than as the Woolworth heiress. December 21, 1930, Sunday, New York City. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel hummed with nervous energy as millions of dollars prepared to burn in a single evening. Outside, bread lines snaked around corners, and men with hollow eyes sold apples for pennies. But inside the ballroom, the air was perfumed with thousands of dollars worth of rare orchids imported from distant continents to die in the heat of crystal chandeliers. Barbara stood in the center of the room, in a gown that shimmered like captured starlight, 18 years old, and possessing a face of delicate porcelain beauty. To onlookers in the press, this was American royalty on display. To Barbara, it felt less like a celebration and more like an auction. The $60,000 price tag for the evening represented more than most families would earn in a lifetime, a fact that newspapers would trumpet with mixture of awe and disgust. Young men competed for her attention, their interest transparently focused on her fortune rather than her person. Debutantes whispered behind gloved hands, their envy mixed with pity. Everyone wanted something from her: access to her wealth, association with her name, entry into her exclusive world. No one simply wanted her. As midnight approached and the celebration reached its crescendo, Barbara slipped away to a private balcony overlooking the city. Below, millions struggled with unemployment and hunger. Above, in this gilded ballroom, champagne bubbles caught the light like tiny, ephemeral dreams. She understood, with clarity beyond her years, that she stood on the wrong side of a divide that money had created but could not bridge. Her father watched from the periphery, a man who saw the party not as a gift, but as an investment, a way to display the merchandise to eligible bachelors. He did not see the trembling of her hands or the way she looked at the door, wishing she could simply disappear. He saw only the Woolworth legacy, solidified in flesh and diamonds. A question formed in Barbara's mind that night, one that would haunt her remaining years. What was the point of possessing everything if it meant experiencing nothing real? Standing on that balcony, she was only beginning to understand the true cost of being born rich beyond measure and loved by no one at all. The promise of wealth is that it buys freedom, but for Barbara, it had only bought a more expensive cage. The world saw a lucky girl who had won life's lottery, but they couldn't see that the ticket came with a price she would spend the next 50 years paying, piece by agonizing piece. Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. Throughout the 1930s, Barbara Hutton embarked on a desperate quest for love, believing that somewhere in the world existed a man who would cherish her for herself rather than her fortune. Her escape to Europe led to her first marriage to Count Alexis Mdivani in 1933, a Georgian aristocrat whose noble title masked his fortune-hunting intentions. The marriage quickly devolved into psychological abuse as Mdivani systematically undermined Barbara's confidence while spending her money with breathtaking extravagance. When Barbara finally divorced him in 1935, he walked away with $2 million, establishing the pattern that would define her romantic life. Her second marriage to Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow produced her only child, Lance, but the union proved equally disastrous. Reventlow's controlling nature and verbal cruelty drove Barbara to seek solace in prescription medications, beginning her lifelong struggle with addiction. The press dubbed her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that captured both public fascination and mockery. By decade's end, Barbara had learned that her wealth made genuine love impossible, yet she remained unable to stop searching for it, trapped in a cycle of hope and betrayal that would consume both her fortune and her spirit. June 20, 1933, Tuesday, Paris, France. The Russian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Alexander Nevsky witnessed Barbara Hutton's first wedding, a ceremony that combined old-world grandeur with new-world wealth. Count Alexis Mendovani cut a dashing figure in his mourning coat, his dark eyes and aristocratic bearing suggesting noble lineage and refined character. Barbara, radiant in ivory silk and Brussels lace, believed she had finally found what her fortune could not buy, a man who loved her for herself alone. The belief proved tragically mistaken. Alexis belonged to a family of Georgian expatriates who had perfected the art of marrying rich American women. His credentials were dubious, his affection non-existent, but his charm was undeniable. What he possessed was an insatiable appetite for spending Barbara's money and an intuitive understanding of her deepest vulnerabilities. Within months of the wedding, Alexis revealed his true nature. He purchased a polo field in Paris, explaining that a gentleman of his standing required proper facilities for sport. The cost exceeded $500,000. He commissioned custom automobiles, acquired racehorses, and hosted extravagant parties where champagne flowed like water and guests consumed caviar by the pound. When Barbara hesitantly questioned these expenditures, Alexis responded with wounded pride, suggesting that she valued money more than his happiness. But the financial exploitation was merely the surface of a deeper cruelty. In the privacy of their lavish suites, away from adoring crowds, Alexis became a psychological tormentor. He would look at Barbara with cold, critical eyes and tell her she was too fat, too plain, too boring. He convinced her that no one could possibly love her for herself, that she was nothing without the Woolworth millions. These words, spoken by the man she adored, cut deeper than any knife. Desperate to please him, to fit the mold of the ethereal princess he demanded, Barbara stopped eating. She subsisted on black coffee and cigarettes, starving her body in a futile attempt to feed her soul. The anorexia that would plague her for the rest of her life took root here, in the marble bathrooms of Paris hotels. She would stare into mirrors, pinching non-existent fat on her waist, seeing a monster where others saw beauty. The weight dropped from her frame, leaving her frail and trembling, but Alexis was never satisfied. Alexis made little effort to conceal his affairs with other women, conducting liaisons so openly that servants gossiped and society columnists printed barely veiled innuendos. Barbara, humiliated but still clinging to hope, convinced herself that she could win his love through greater generosity. She purchased palaces, thinking exotic surroundings might rekindle romance. She even bought jewelry for Alexis's mistresses, a gesture of desperate appeasement that only highlighted her powerlessness. May 1935, Wednesday, Reno, Nevada. Barbara obtained her divorce in America's capital of quick separations, joining countless other wealthy women who had discovered that money could end marriages more easily than it could create happy ones. The settlement awarded Alexis $2 million, payment for less than 2 years of marriage. Newspapers reported the figure with a mixture of shock and schadenfreude. The poor little rich girl had paid dearly for her first lesson in love. But Barbara proved incapable of learning from experience. Her wealth, rather than protecting her, made her vulnerable to predators who recognized her desperate need for affection. Within months of divorcing Alexis, she met Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat whose credentials proved only marginally more authentic than Endavani's. Kurt possessed classical Nordic good looks and an air of brooding intensity that Barbara mistook for depth of character. November 1935, Friday, London, England. Barbara's second wedding took place at Winfield House, the Regent's Park mansion she had purchased and renovated at enormous expense. The ceremony attracted less publicity than her first marriage, partly because Barbara had requested privacy, partly because the public was growing weary of her romantic misadventures. Kurt played his role perfectly during the courtship and early marriage, affecting devotion while carefully positioning himself to access Barbara's fortune. The union produced one genuine blessing, Lance Reventlow, born in February 1936. Barbara loved her son with an intensity that terrified her, recognizing in his tiny face the vulnerability she herself had experienced as a motherless child. She vowed to provide him with the emotional security she had never known, to break the cycle of wealth without warmth that had defined her own upbringing. But Kurt had different plans for their son. He insisted on rigid European discipline, on raising Lance according to aristocratic traditions that emphasized emotional restraint and social hierarchy. When Barbara protested, Kurt revealed the controlling nature he had previously concealed. He began isolating her from friends, monitoring her activities, and demanding ever larger allowances to maintain his lifestyle. The stress became unbearable. To cope with the emotional agony of her failing marriage and the physical tension of Kurt's psychological abuse, Barbara turned to pills. It started with painkillers prescribed after Lance's difficult birth, then sedatives to help her sleep through Kurt's rages, then stimulants to wake up and face each new day. The bottles multiplied on her nightstand like a pharmaceutical army, each promising relief that never quite arrived. The press, which had initially sympathized with Barbara's search for love, now turned cruel. Columnists mocked her poor judgment in men. Cartoonists depicted her as a foolish woman throwing money at unworthy suitors. The nickname "poor little rich girl" became less sympathetic observation than cutting joke. Barbara read these accounts in her various mansions and hotel suites, understanding that her private pain had become public entertainment. 1938, Monday, Cuernavaca, Mexico. Barbara's second divorce played out in a Mexican courtroom, with Kurt fighting viciously for custody of Lance and maximum financial settlement. The proceedings revealed intimate details of their marriage, Kurt's verbal abuse, Barbara's emotional fragility, their mutual inability to create a functional family despite unlimited resources. The judge awarded Kurt a substantial settlement and partial custody, meaning Barbara would spend years watching her son shuttle between households, never fully belonging to either. Walking away from her second failed marriage, Barbara confronted a devastating reality. Her wealth made genuine love impossible. Men approached her not as potential partners, but as opportunities for enrichment. Her fortune preceded her into every room, every relationship, every possibility of connection. She could not separate herself from her money, could not present herself simply as Barbara rather than Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress. Yet she could not stop trying. Something in her nature, some combination of hope and desperation, drove her forward into relationship after relationship. By the end of the 1930s, she had lost not millions, but tens of millions to divorce settlements, and she had gained only deeper understanding of her fundamental isolation. The question that had formed during her debutante ball now had a partial answer. Perhaps the point of possessing everything was to discover that nothing could be truly possessed, least of all love. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. World War II found Barbara Hutton seeking refuge from both global conflict and personal demons across various continents. In 1942, she married Cary Grant in what seemed like her most promising relationship. Grant was the only husband who didn't need her money and genuinely cared for her well-being. Their marriage, dubbed Cash and Carry by the press, offered Barbara a glimpse of what love without financial motivation might look like. Grant attempted to intervene in her escalating drug addiction and encouraged her to seek genuine fulfillment beyond material possessions. However, Barbara's deep-seated insecurities and inability to accept unconditional love ultimately sabotaged the relationship. Their divorce in 1945 was amicable but devastating for Barbara, as she had driven away the one man who might have saved her. Following this loss, she spiraled into a severe health crisis, undergoing multiple unnecessary surgeries while deepening her addiction to prescription medications. Her subsequent marriage to Prince Igor Trubetskoy in 1947 marked the beginning of her most destructive period, as Igor combined physical abuse with financial exploitation. The chapter culminates with the ultimate tragedy, the death of her son Lance in a 1972 plane crash, shattering Barbara completely and removing her last connection to genuine love and purpose. July 8, 1942, Wednesday, Lake Arrowhead, California. As Nazi Germany tightened its grip on Europe and the world descended into chaos, Barbara Hutton found an unexpected sanctuary in the hills of California. Her marriage to Cary Grant shocked Hollywood and delighted gossip columnists, who immediately dubbed them Cash and Carrie. But for once, the cynical press had misjudged the situation. Grant, born Archibald Leach in working-class England, had transformed himself into the epitome of sophisticated masculinity through talent and determination rather than inheritance. He possessed international fame, genuine charisma, and, crucially for Barbara, his own fortune. The ceremony was small by Barbara's standards, held at the lakeside retreat with only close friends in attendance. For the first time in her adult life, Barbara was marrying someone who didn't need her money, someone who looked at her with what appeared to be genuine affection rather than calculating interest. Grant understood the burden of public performance, the exhaustion of living behind a carefully constructed facade. Both had learned to be someone other than who they were born to be. The early months of their marriage offered Barbara a glimpse of what normal life might feel like. Grant treated her with kindness, even tenderness. He encouraged her to read books, to engage with ideas rather than just luxury. In quiet evenings at their Malibu home, they would sit together talking about their respective childhoods, his poverty, her wealth, both equally damaging in different ways. Barbara dared to hope that she had finally found someone who saw past her money to the wounded woman beneath. But Grant also saw things that alarmed him. He noticed how Barbara's hands shook until she took her morning pills, how she barely picked at her food, how she surrounded herself with sycophants who whispered poison in her ear to maintain their positions at her table. He watched her son Lance, now a young boy, being raised more by servants than by his mother, who was often too medicated to provide consistent attention. Grant tried to save her. He urged her to eat, to reduce her medication, to dismiss the hangers on who encouraged her worst habits. He attempted to clear their house of the fake princes and drug-peddling doctors who had attached themselves to Barbara like parasites. But Barbara fought him. She was so accustomed to buying affection that free love felt worthless to her, suspicious in its lack of conditions. When Grant offered her love without price, she didn't know how to receive it. Her psyche was a landscape of craters left by abandonment and abuse. If he didn't want her money, why was he there? She began to push him away, retreating into the chemical haze that had become her refuge from emotional pain. The very generosity that might have healed her became another source of anxiety. The crisis came not with screaming arguments, but with quiet exhaustion. Grant, heartbroken by Barbara's refusal to accept help and frustrated by her insistence on maintaining her toxic entourage, realized he could not save a woman who did not want to be saved. Their divorce in 1945 was the only one in Barbara's life where she didn't have to pay a settlement. Grant walked away with nothing but his dignity and a broken heart. For Barbara, the loss was catastrophic. She had driven away the only lifeguard in her stormy sea, the one man who might have anchored her to something real and stable. Without Grant's moderating influence, she surrendered completely to her demons. She began seeking solace in the surgeon's knife, convinced that if she could just fix her body, her soul would follow. She underwent surgery after surgery for imaginary ailments, for cosmetic tweaks, for anything that justified the heavy painkillers she craved. March 1, 1947, Saturday, Reno, Nevada. Barbara's marriage to Prince Igor Trubetskoy began in the same courthouse where she had ended her first marriage. Igor, a Russian aristocrat whose title meant nothing in the post-revolutionary world, had been circling Barbara for months, waiting for her vulnerability to reach critical mass. Unlike her previous husbands, who had been obvious in their exploitation, Igor presented himself as her protector, someone who would shield her from the predators constantly seeking her fortune. The truth revealed itself within weeks of the wedding. Igor's protection manifested as control. He monitored her phone calls, screened her visitors, and gradually isolated her from anyone who might question his behavior. When Barbara hesitantly objected, Igor responded with verbal abuse that escalated into physical violence. He struck her during arguments, then apologized with theatrical remorse, promising change while ensuring none occurred. Barbara found herself trapped in a cycle of abuse that millions of women experience, regardless of wealth. Her money was useless against Igor's brutality because leaving required psychological strength that years of trauma had eroded. She told no one about the violence, maintaining the public fiction of her marriage while privately enduring degradation that left bruises hidden beneath expensive clothes. Igor spent her money as freely as her previous husbands, but with additional cruelty. He would purchase extravagant gifts for other women using Barbara's accounts, ensuring she saw the receipts. He hosted parties where he openly flirted with guests, while Barbara sat silent, medicated, and diminished. He convinced her that she was worthless, that no one else would tolerate her neuroses, that she should be grateful he remained despite her many failings. During these years, Barbara's health collapsed catastrophically. She had always been slender, but now her weight dropped below 90 pounds. She existed on cigarettes, champagne, and an ever-expanding collection of prescription pills. Her famous beauty, which had graced magazine covers throughout the 1930s, withered. Her skin took on a grayish pallor, and her eyes, once bright with hope despite disappointments, became dull and haunted. 1951, Barbara finally gathered strength to divorce Igor, but the separation came too late to prevent permanent damage. She was 38 years old and looked 60. More devastating than financial loss was the psychological destruction. Barbara had learned, through years of systematic abuse, to expect betrayal. She trusted no one, least of all herself. The pattern continued through 3 more brief marriages, to Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican playboy, Baron Gottfried von Kram, a German tennis champion, and Prince Pierre d'Oenvin na Champasak, a Laotian royal. Each marriage lasted only months, each husband extracted substantial settlements, and each departure left Barbara more damaged. August 24, 1972, Thursday, Aspen, Colorado. The phone call came on a clear morning in the Colorado mountains. Barbara was in her suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, recovering from another health crisis, when her lawyer's voice delivered news that shattered what remained of her will to live. Lance Raventlow, her only child, the one person who might have provided meaning to her existence, had died in a plane crash at age 36. The loss was incomprehensible. Barbara had survived 7 failed marriages, countless betrayals, and decades of addiction. But she could not survive losing Lance. He had been her justification for enduring everything else, the proof that something good had emerged from her suffering. Without him, she was simply a dying woman in a golden room. After Lance's death, Barbara essentially stopped trying. She made no effort to maintain her health, refused most medical treatments, and increased her medication dosages to levels that would have killed someone with less developed tolerance. The question from her debutante ball had evolved into something darker. Perhaps the point of possessing everything was to discover that even the most precious things, a child's love, a mother's purpose, could be lost forever, and no amount of money could bring them back. Chapter 4: The Unraveling. The 1970s marked Barbara Hutton's complete descent into physical and financial ruin. Following her son's death, she retreated to her palace in Tangier, Morocco, where she held court like a decaying queen surrounded by thieves and sycophants. Her legendary generosity became pathological as she gave away priceless jewelry to strangers and paid people simply to sit with her, terrified of silence and solitude. Her health deteriorated catastrophically. She suffered strokes, heart problems, and mysterious ailments attributed to decades of substance abuse and malnutrition. Her weight fluctuated wildly as she alternated between starvation and binge eating, her famous beauty ravaged by stress and addiction. The fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible began disappearing at an alarming rate through poor investments, extravagant spending, and systematic theft by those she trusted. Properties were sold, jewelry auctioned, and assets liquidated to maintain her lifestyle and pay for round-the-clock medical care. A devastating twist emerges as Barbara discovers that her most trusted advisors and companions have been systematically robbing her, but she lacks the energy to fight back, choosing to pay for the illusion of loyalty rather than face the reality of her complete isolation. By the late 1970s, the woman who had inherited over $50 million was selling her last possessions to pay hotel bills. October 1975, Wednesday, Sidi Hosni Palace, Tangier, Morocco. The air in Tangier was thick with the scent of jasmine and decay. High within the walls of the Sidi Hosni Palace, Barbara Hutton presided over a court of ghosts and thieves. She was 63 years old but looked decades older, her body ravaged by years of starvation and addiction. Her eyesight was failing, her movements slow and painful, yet she remained the hostess of the most extravagant parties in North Africa. The palace was a fortress of luxury, filled with ancient silks, priceless rugs, and the constant murmur of people who were there for the wine, not the woman. Barbara's life had become a blur of meaningless social interactions, a revolving door of guests who arrived as strangers and left as temporary friends, their pockets heavier with her gifts. She would sit on her terrace, draped in caftans that hid her emaciated frame, wearing the Romanov emeralds or the Pasha diamond, engaging visitors in disjointed conversations as her mind drifted between present and past. In moments of impulsive desperation, she would unclasp a diamond bracelet worth a king's ransom and press it into the hand of a guest she had met only an hour before. "Take it," she would whisper, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes and medication. "It's too heavy for me." It wasn't generosity. It was a plea. She was paying a toll to keep the darkness at bay, buying moments of human contact with jewels that had once adorned European royalty. Her staff had multiplied into a small army of servants, secretaries, and hangers-on, each drawing salaries that seemed modest individually, but collectively drained hundreds of thousands from her accounts. She employed people to read to her, to sit with her, to simply be present in rooms where silence had become unbearable. The palace operated like a small hotel, with guests staying for weeks or months, their expenses covered by a hostess too damaged to calculate the cost. But beneath the surface of her pharmaceutical fog, Barbara was not entirely blind to what was happening. In rare moments of clarity, she would catch a servant pocketing a silver cigarette case or notice discrepancies in her accounts that her lawyers explained away with complex financial jargon. She knew they were stealing from her, the staff, the advisors, the companions who professed loyalty while systematically looting her fortune. The realization came gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. Her financial manager, who had promised to simplify her affairs during the worst of her grief after Lance's death, had been siphoning money into shell companies with opaque names. Her lawyers charged double fees for services never rendered. Her medical team prescribed expensive treatments that served no purpose beyond justifying their presence. Even her closest companions sold stories to tabloids, trading her privacy for cash. When Barbara finally understood the scope of the betrayal, she didn't call the police or fire the thieves. She simply turned her head. Fighting required energy she no longer possessed, and confrontation meant facing the truth that everyone around her was there for money, not affection. She allowed the theft because it was the price of having warm bodies in the room, of maintaining the illusion that someone cared whether she lived or died. Her health continued its inexorable decline. She suffered a series of minor strokes that left her with slurred speech and impaired motor control. Her heart, weakened by decades of stimulant abuse, beat irregularly. She developed osteoporosis so severe that minor falls resulted in fractures. Her weight dropped to dangerous levels as she alternated between refusing food entirely and vomiting what little she managed to consume. The financial hemorrhaging accelerated as medical costs mounted. Barbara required round-the-clock nursing care, teams of specialists, and constant hospitalization for ailments that were largely self-inflicted but nonetheless expensive to treat. The trust funds established by her grandfather, once seemingly inexhaustible, were being depleted through decades of settlements, extravagant spending, and systematic mismanagement. June 1977, Monday, Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Los Angeles. Barbara had returned to California, trading her Moroccan palace for a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The move marked another stage in her decline. She could no longer maintain the staff and expenses required for palace living. The hotel suite, though luxurious by ordinary standards, represented a dramatic downsizing from her previous lifestyle. Her lawyers warned her repeatedly about her financial situation. Unless she drastically reduced expenses, bankruptcy was inevitable within months. But Barbara had lived her entire life, assuming money would always appear when needed. The concept of actual poverty, of lacking resources for basic necessities, remained abstract even as it approached reality. She refused to leave the Beverly Wilshire, which had become her world, the only stable element in a life of constant motion. The staff knew her routines, understood her needs, and treated her with deference born partly of her former wealth and partly of pity. Moving to more modest accommodations would mean confronting her reduced circumstances in a way Barbara could not psychologically manage. Instead, she began liquidating her remaining assets. The jewelry collection that had once been valued in the millions disappeared piece by piece into auction houses. A diamond necklace that had belonged to Marie Antoinette went to a private collector. Jade pieces acquired during her travels in Asia were sold to pay medical bills. Each sale bought a few more months at the hotel, a few more months of nurses and medications, and the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. The isolation was profound. Barbara's surviving relatives stayed away, either unable to help or unwilling to witness her condition. Former friends from her calf society days had died or disappeared into their own old age. The husbands who had taken so much from her felt no obligation to return even a fraction of what they had extracted. Barbara existed surrounded by paid attendants, but connected to no one through genuine affection or shared history. Her fortune, which had once seemed as permanent as the Woolworth building itself, was running out with mathematical inevitability. The woman who had never learned to balance a checkbook was discovering that even the largest accounts could be emptied if enough people drew from them for long enough. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. Millions in, more millions out, the difference shrinking towards zero with each passing month. In her lucid hours, Barbara composed explanations in her mind, narratives that might render her story comprehensible. Perhaps she had been cursed from birth, marked by her mother's death for inevitable tragedy. Perhaps her grandfather's fortune had been tainted, destined to bring misery to his descendants. But in her most honest moments, she acknowledged a darker truth. She had been complicit in her own destruction, choosing men she knew were using her, medicating pain instead of addressing its sources, spending compulsively to fill an emptiness that no purchase could satisfy. The unraveling was total now, visible to anyone who cared to look. The woman who had once captivated the world had become a cautionary tale whispered about in the salons of Paris and New York. She lay in her hotel bed, the scent of jasmine replaced by antiseptic, waiting for the end of a party that had gone on far too long. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. Barbara Hutton's final years unfolded in the penthouse suite of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, where she lived as a virtual recluse, bedridden and requiring constant medical care. Her health had deteriorated to the point where she weighed less than 90 pounds, was nearly blind from cataracts, and could barely walk. The fortune that had once exceeded $50 million had dwindled to almost nothing through decades of poor decisions, exploitation, and systematic theft. She sold her remaining jewelry piece by piece to pay for medical care and hotel bills, each transaction bringing her closer to destitution. Former friends and family members stayed away, unable or unwilling to witness her final decline. The press, which had once obsessed over her every move, largely forgot about her. She had become irrelevant, a relic of a bygone era. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died alone in her hotel suite at age 66. When lawyers tallied her estate, they discovered the shocking truth. The woman who had inherited one of America's greatest fortunes had died with only $3,500 to her name. Her death received minimal coverage, a brief obituary noting her marriages and inheritance, but failing to capture the profound tragedy of a life defined by wealth, yet empty of love, security, or peace. The final chapter serves as a meditation on the true meaning of wealth and poverty, concluding that Barbara's greatest tragedy was not financial, but emotional. She had spent her entire life starving at a banquet, surrounded by luxury, but never finding the human connection she desperately craved. May 11, 1979, Friday, Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Los Angeles. The room was perpetually dim, heavy curtains drawn tight against the California sunshine that Barbara could no longer see. At 66 years old, the woman who had once traveled the world on private yachts and dined with kings was confined to a single hotel suite. Her universe shrunk to the dimensions of a bedroom and sitting area that had become both sanctuary and prison. Barbara weighed 85 pounds, her body consuming itself for fuel as she existed primarily on cigarettes, champagne, and an ever-changing cocktail of prescription medications. Her eyes, once bright and searching, were clouded by cataracts and decades of tears. Her hands, formerly adorned with rings worth fortunes, now trembled with palsy as she reached for water glasses or pill bottles. The famous beauty who had graced magazine covers throughout the 1930s had withered to a skeletal figure, wrapped in expensive silk pajamas that hung on her frame like garments on a wire hanger. There were no princes here in these final days, no counts, no barons, no playboys seeking her favor. The entourage had vanished the moment the checks started bouncing, their loyalty as artificial as their titles. The only people left were the hotel staff and private nurses who changed her sheets, held straws to her lips, and administered the medications that kept her suspended between consciousness and oblivion. In a final, bitter irony, these paid employees showed her more genuine tenderness than the husbands who had sworn eternal love before disappearing with their settlements. Barbara would reach out with a skeletal hand, her fingers devoid of the heavy rings that had once defined her status, and stroke the arm of a nurse, whispering thanks for small kindnesses. She had learned, too late, to value the simple human gestures that money could not buy, a gentle touch, a patient ear, the dignity of being treated as a person rather than a bank account. Her days blended together in a twilight state of memory and medication. She drifted through the corridors of her past, sometimes believing she was back in the ballroom of her debutante party, the music swelling around her. Other times she was in Venice, the water lapping against a gondola, or holding Lance as an infant, breathing in the scent of baby powder and hope. But then the memories would darken, the slap of a hand, the cold stare of a father, the flash of camera bulbs capturing her humiliation. She would whimper in her sleep, a small, broken sound that vanished into the plush carpet of the hotel suite. The lawyers and executors who had managed her affairs for decades delivered their final reports with clinical detachment. The houses were gone, sold to pay debts. The jewelry had been liquidated piece by piece. The art collection, once valued in millions, had disappeared into auction houses. The trust funds established by her grandfather, designed to provide security for generations, had been exhausted through decades of poor investments, extravagant spending, and systematic theft by those she had trusted most. Her checking account, the final repository of the Woolworth fortune, contained $3,500. The number was almost incomprehensible in its stark simplicity. $3,500, less than the cost of the flowers at her debutante ball, a fraction of the price of a single gown she had worn in Paris, barely enough to cover a week's expenses at the hotel where she lay dying. The woman who had inherited over $50 million, who had owned palaces and jewels, who had been married to counts and princes, was leaving an estate smaller than what many middle-class Americans accumulate through modest savings. The end came quietly on a Friday morning. There was no dramatic crescendo, no final words, no gathering of loved ones. Barbara simply stopped breathing during her sleep, her damaged heart finally surrendering after decades of abuse. A nurse discovered her body during a routine check, finding her lying peacefully for perhaps the first time in her adult life. The obituary in the New York Times was brief, focusing on her marriages and her inheritance, treating her life as a cautionary tale about the emptiness of wealth. The headline read simply, "Barbara Hutton, Heiress, dies at 66. There was no mention of her kindness to staff, her genuine attempts to find love, her suffering through years of abuse and addiction. She was reduced to her most public characteristics: rich, married often, died poor. But the arithmetic of her life revealed a different kind of accounting. The tragedy was not the money lost. Money, after all, was merely paper and metal, numbers in ledgers that could be earned and spent and earned again. The true tragedy was that Barbara Hutton had spent her entire life starving at a banquet, surrounded by luxury, but never finding the human connection she desperately craved. She had been a child who lost her mother, a young woman desperate for love, an adult unable to distinguish genuine affection from calculated exploitation. Her money had been both her defining characteristic and her fundamental curse, making her simultaneously powerful and helpless, desired and alone. She had tried to buy love and discovered it was the one thing that could never be purchased. She had sought security and found that wealth itself was the source of her greatest vulnerability. As her body was carried from the hotel through the lobby where she had once walked as American royalty, the silence was profound. The script of her life had been written in gold ink, but it ended in tears. Finally, stripped of the burden of her inheritance, stripped of the titles and expectations that had defined her existence, Barbara was free. The poor little rich girl was no longer poor, and she was no longer rich. She was simply at peace, having learned through brutal experience that the human heart cannot be purchased, that love cannot be bought, and that the only wealth that truly matters is the kind that cannot be counted in dollars or measured in carats. She had possessed everything the world deemed valuable, and died having discovered that none of it was worth the price she had paid, a lifetime of emotional starvation in rooms filled with gold.